Hello everyone. Today we have Andy Coravos, who's the CEO and co-founder of HumanFirst, a company that helps deploy decentralized clinical trials in distributed care. HumanFirst achieves this through its command center and infrastructure offerings, which are as reliable and trustworthy as those within hospitals or labs. From her work at the FDA's Digital Health Unit to the co-founding of Digital Medicine Society, Andy has been a leader pushing the healthcare industry forward in the era of digital medicine. Pleasure to have you here, Andy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks.
Can you tell our audience about the problem you're solving with at HumanFirst?
Sure. I had the opportunity to serve at the FDA in the Digital Health Unit. And one of the things that was happening was historically, the FDA has looked at a number of different medical products, and those could be drugs, they can be devices, they can be different types of food. But what's been happening in the last couple of years is personal computing has become really powerful. And so you have all these software-driven sensors. And where do these things fit? What if you use these different types of sensors to support a clinical trial? Then they're part of a clinical trial drug application. But sometimes these sensors can also be devices on their own where you're measuring somebody's certain type of, maybe you're making a diagnostic measurement, maybe you're collecting a digital biomarker, maybe sometimes they're intervening with these digital therapeutics. So one of the things that was really great was the FDA was starting to hire software engineers and people who worked in security into the agency. And that was my background. And so I got hired as an entrepreneur in residence there and got my first taste of these different types of products and worked with companies like Apple and Fitbit and Samsung and Fitbit that were all doing something called the pre-cert program. So one of the things that I started getting really interested in was broadly, how do we bring healthcare home? And within bringing healthcare home, you can think about it in two ways. One is physically reaching someone at home. So you and I are now on a video, we could do voice calls, but you can also send home maybe devices or collect these different types of digital measures. Sometimes digital measures are collected at home, but they can also be collected in a lab or in a hospital or in a clinic. So there's really these two things that are happening. One is moving healthcare home, and then sometimes you use maybe an analog sensor, maybe it's not connected, at the home environment, or you're using a digital tool that could be at the home or not. So where our team spends most of our time in HumanFirst is really around collecting digital measures. Many times people are using these in the home environment, but sometimes they're using them in hospital and settings. And it's really around using internet connected sensors to collect measurements that better reflect and understand the quality of life or certain conditions within a disease.
So broadly, digital biomarkers, I think this is a fairly recent concept. Which therapeutic areas do you see adopting these kind of digital devices and biomarkers?
Yeah, so one thing that's really interesting is just broadly, the term biomarker has a really specific regulatory connotation. And so there's often two different things that people are talking about. You can have a biomarker, which is pretty old, or you can have a clinical outcome assessment, which is how somebody feels, functions, or survives. And so if you're measuring, say, imagine you're measuring something like gait speed, like how fast somebody's walking, sometimes that could be a biomarker measurement, but sometimes that could be a clinical outcome assessment. So the same measurement, depending on how it used, could be a digital biomarker or it could be a clinical outcome assessment. And so the way I'll answer this question is broadly, both of these are types of digitally collected measures. And so where a lot of these digital measures are used, right now, the best digital measures are often used with things that use accelerometers and gyroscopes. So that results in a lot of things that are movement related. So certain types of neurocognition, Parkinson's, Huntington's, there's a lot of neuro in there. There's other areas that people are looking changes in activity or changes in sleep. So accelerometers and gyroscopes are used for those as well. There's some new areas where people are looking at fatigue. They're looking at movement, even like place movements, GPS-based coordinates. And there's other types of digitally collected measures. So maybe you're using a connected sensor for a continuous glucometer. Perhaps you're using it for scratch, nocturnal scratch. So these are being used in lots of places. One of the things that's been really exciting for me is during the pandemic, people had a really challenging question, particularly pharma companies, of do we stop our clinical trial, which we've been doing for years, or do we shift more of the measures at home? And within shifting at home, sometimes that was collected in an analog fashion, but sometimes it was used using these sensors. So there's a nonprofit called the Digital Medicine Society. And over the last 2 years, over 62 sponsors, which are pharma companies that are sponsoring a trial, have deployed digital measures in their clinical trials, which is pretty wild.
Yeah. And you mentioned about the different devices, the Fitbit, Apple, and other devices. Uh, your platform brings together all these devices, collects the digital signals, and helps with the remote monitoring. So, how do you use data analytics, machine learning as part of your solution, Andy?
Yeah, so one way to think about an analogy, so our platform is the metadata on the different types of sensors. So imagine something like a pharmacy. So imagine you have somebody who has cancer, and maybe it's a very special type of cancer. You might go to a specialty pharmacist and say, hey, this person has a special type of cancer. What are the drug options that are available? So then that pharmacist would say, here's the different types of drugs that are available for that person. They could package them, they could ship them in a certain way and send them out. But the pharmacist doesn't necessarily know if they took the pill, right? The pharmacist is helping with the formulary and sending it out. Similarly, what we do is somebody comes to us and say, hey, we're trying to measure sleep or activity or scratch. We track thousands of different sensors. And what we do is similar to, you would never ask somebody, what's the best drug or what's the best food? You're like, well, do you need more sugar? Do you need more protein? We build labels for these different types of connected tech. So we say, how much evidence do they have? What's their security profile? What are their data rights? Can you wear it in the bathroom? Or like, can you wear it in the shower? What happens when it gets wet? So there's really two types of entities that you would like to have. So one is the one that is doing the operations around it. So we help you look at all the different sensors, pick the right one for that population and get it to the population. Separately, there are other companies that are collecting the data pipelines. And many companies that are collecting, like whether or not how you collect the heart rate and blood pressure, are often very different from the operating companies because those are the data science companies. And so you structure them in very different ways. And so you'll need a data pipeline set of folks, and you're also going to need like air traffic control and operations sets of folks. So all of the work that we do with our machine learning and our algorithms is really on the metadata and managing the sensors, and less on developing a custom biomarker, which is often the way that you'll have a more custom dev shop for deciding a certain type of like statistical analysis for a measure.
Okay, understood. More you partner with the device makers and the companies that run these clinical trials in terms of what devices are best for the trial. Is that a right assessment?
Right. Okay. Exactly.
And acting as a metadata, I think when you have so many devices and so many different types of sensors, it could be challenging. I looked at your website. You mentioned about hundreds of probably thousands of devices. Data inter-exchange integration, I'm assuming, could be a big challenge there.
Totally. So there's a couple things to think about. So first, before we get even to like data integration or data exchange, imagine that you came to somebody and you said, I want to measure sleep. Mm-hmm. What is sleep? You know, your Fitbit doesn't know if you slept, your Apple Watch doesn't know if you slept. Is sleep number of minutes that you were in bed? Is it number of times you woke up? Was it bouts of deep sleep? Was it how long you were in bed until you first woke up? That would be wake after sleep onset. Was it number of times that you woke up? There's probably 35 different ways of measuring sleep. So what our team does first is we've ingested thousands of peer review papers, clinical trials, and regulatory decisions. And we first say, what are you measuring? And then what have people done in the past? So then you can compare all the different types of sleep. Then, of course, maybe you say, okay, we want to do wake after sleep onset. People could all measure wake after sleep onset in a different way. Same with activity. Imagine somebody says, okay, let's look at activity. Is that how fast you ran? How far you ran? How intensely you ran? And so people work with our teams to segment the evidence base for the type of measurement. Then once you have a specific type of measurement, you would do probably the next question that you're asking is, how do I know that my measurement of intensity on one sensor is the same as my measurement on intensity in the other sensor? And then when these sensors get software updates, how do we work with them? So we're much farther up the chain to really help make sure that people have the validation for the clinical reasons of measuring those. And then you would get into the technical reasons of, you know, can I compare sample A with sample B as similar measurements?
Yeah, I think defining that upfront, and particularly in the early stages where this concept is still catching up, could be a challenge. When you work with pharma companies, and do you see challenges in adopting these new forms of digital measurement?
You know, there's challenges that pharma has right now. So like about half of the trials, they have trouble recruiting. The number one reason why people have trouble recruiting for a trial is the number one reason is people don't want the placebo, which we can't help with. But the number two reason is travel. So the more that you can help people in their own environment, they can recruit and in a much different way. And imagine that you're trying to measure someone's sleep. If you're in a Pfizer bedroom, like you're not going to sleep well compared to your sleep at home. And so one of the things is of course, there's challenges with measuring them, but it also has a huge implication. So if you're a pharma company and you're only collecting maybe one measurement a month or one measurement every couple years, you would never approve a drug based on one blood sugar reading, right? Like, did you eat sugar? Did you eat pizza? There's so many things when you need to have more longitudinal data for folks. And so once people decide that this is really meaningful data, that is something that is important for us as we go through, then the challenges that people start to think through is, how do I do validation? So one thing our team has done is we've worked with a number of different groups to have open source documentation on how do you do verification versus analytical validation versus clinical validation. We published that all openly and with a lot of academic journals.
Yeah. Can you share any anecdotes or examples of how companies or trials have been used digital biomarkers and achieved certain things which were not possible with the conventional modes earlier?
Sure. So one example was like the GI example. Another one for companies that we've been working with is, if you think about cancer, one of the ways that people look at cancer treatments is effectively progression-free survival, which is, did you die or did you not die? But how do you know if they lived better, slept better, moved better? So there's a lot of movement and shifts to doing quality of life measures. And then a third one that's really been interesting for me, and Digital Medicine Society published on this, was around, and actually the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative was around Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So with Duchenne's, it's a condition that predominantly affects men, and the gold standard for Duchenne's is a 6-minute walk test. Now, about 70% of people who have Duchenne's are in a wheelchair, so they can't walk. So if you're running a Duchenne's trial and your endpoint is a 6-minute walk test, everybody who's in a wheelchair, which is the majority of people who have it, are excluded from the trial because they can't participate with that endpoint. So what people have been, and so then you're effectively only developing a Duchenne's drug on the healthier group that has not yet progressed to being in a wheelchair. So what people are looking at is, okay, so a 6-minute walk test is a functional performance test. Could we do that maybe with an arm movement instead of walking? And so people are shifting how they're thinking about developing these endpoints. And then that allows you to actually recruit fundamentally differently. And in my view, develop more robust and better drugs for populations that are more relevant.
Yeah, I think reassessing the criteria and solving some of these recruitment challenges, I think that sounds very powerful. Last question, Andy. Can you think of a future, and what is the dream state that you can think of where digital biomarkers can transform healthcare?
Yeah, so I mean, part of the thing that I love is I hope that over time, the way that we develop a lot of these medical products is really part of care. So right now in our healthcare system, we have a fee-for-service system where if you do 3 surgeries, you get paid 3 times. But what if you messed up the first surgery? Why are you continuing to get paid off of all of those? And so what I would really love to do and have in our future is more outcomes-based measures. Historically, outcomes have been maybe, was somebody admitted to the hospital, or like major events, or you have to collect survey data, which nobody likes filling in. What if we actually have a better way of measuring the day-to-day outcomes for people? And so you're able to do much better nudges, and we could actually shift, especially since we're in a capitalist society that wants to measure things. Right now, we do fee for service just because we can file claims. But if you can actually measure based on outcomes, we could shift to more value-based care, and I think have a much better interplay between products that are developed and then how we actually handle care, and do much more personalized one-on-one measures. And if I spend my lifetime working on that, that would be something I'd feel very proud of.
Yeah, that does sound like a good goal to achieve. Thank you, Andy. It's been great talking to you, and thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it. It's great talking with you.